When you look up at America's first skyscrapers, do you ever wonder who really built them and what it truly cost? Behind the soaring steel and glass, hidden labor shaped every beam. Children as young as 12, pulled from immigrant families and orphanages, risking everything on scaffold and sky. Why did early construction companies turn to child labor to fuel the skyline rush? The truth is not just shocking, it is a story that rewrites what we think we know about these icons. And it demands we ask who paid the highest price for progress. In the closing decades of the 19th century, American cities began to rise in ways few could have imagined. New York, once defined by church spires and brick warehouses, became a battleground for height as steel frame construction unlocked the possibility of buildings climbing 10, 20, even 30 stories above the crowded streets. Between 1885 and 1914, city permit ledgers recorded an astonishing surge. Fewer than 20 buildings over 10 stories stood in New York in 1885. By 1914, that number had soared past 100. The skyline was not just growing, it was accelerating upward at a pace that outstripped anything seen before. Behind this transformation stood a new breed of developer and financier. Syndicates pooled capital, betting fortunes on land that would soon be measured not just by square footage, but by cubic volume. The Flatiron Building, the Singer Tower, and the Woolworth Building each owed their existence to investors who demanded speed and spectacle. For these men, every month shaved from a construction schedule meant thousands of dollars saved or earned. Contractors faced penalty clauses for delays and bonuses for early completion. The pressure to deliver on time and under budget was relentless. Steel changed everything. The adoption of steel frame technology, first tested on the Home Insurance Building in Chicago and quickly embraced in New York, allowed architects to design structures that seemed to defy gravity. Masonry walls no longer bore the weight. Now a skeleton of steel beams and rivets carried the load. This new method promised not only height, but efficiency. Construction could proceed floor by floor, with teams of workers assembling girders and laying floors in dizzying succession. The result was a kind of vertical assembly line, with entire skyscrapers rising in less than 2 years, a feat unthinkable only a generation earlier. As the city's appetite for office space and luxury apartments grew, so did the demand for labor. Building permit records from 1902 show new high-rise projects breaking ground almost every week. The city's Department of Buildings processed applications at a record pace, and construction sites multiplied across Manhattan. Developers and architects became household names, celebrated in newspapers for their ambition and vision. But behind the headlines, the race for height was also a race for cheap, plentiful labor. Contractors scoured the city for anyone willing to work long hours in dangerous conditions. The economic stakes were clear. The faster a building rose, the sooner it could begin generating rent and profit. This drive for speed and savings set the stage for a labor market stretched to its limits. As the skyline grew ever higher, the workforce required to build it became harder to find. The promise of progress, of steel and stone reaching skyward, depended on a steady supply of hands, no matter how small or how young. Union bylaws in the ironworking trades set strict boundaries on who could join their ranks. The International Association of Bridge and Structural Ironworkers by 1900 demanded $3 to $4 per day for journeymen and capped the number of apprentices allowed on any one project. These caps were not just numbers in a ledger, they were enforced through walkouts and blacklisting, making it nearly impossible for contractors to expand their adult workforce even as the city's appetite for new buildings grew. The result was a tight labor market where the supply of skilled hands never matched the flood of new projects. Mortality on these sites only deepened the crisis. Deaths from falls, steel accidents, and exposure were common enough that union rolls often listed more funerals than new members in a bad winter. Seasonal attrition further thinned the ranks. Ironworkers moved to bridge jobs in the summer and left construction sites half-manned in the cold months, leaving contractors scrambling to fill rosters. Contractors faced a kind of arithmetic that was as brutal as it was simple. Every skilled worker lost to injury or death had to be replaced, but union rules blocked rapid hiring. The apprenticeship system, meant to protect wages and standards, created a bottleneck. Only a handful of new trainees could enter each year, and most were sons or nephews of existing members. For outsiders, especially immigrants or the poor, the doors to skilled labor remained firmly closed. The labor shortage was not just about numbers. It became a crisis of cost. Journeyman wage floors set by the unions meant that every adult worker added to a project drove up expenses, threatening profit margins already squeezed by penalty clauses for missed deadlines. Contractors watched budgets balloon as they tried to compete for the few available skilled men, sometimes offering under-the-table bonuses just to keep teams intact until a building topped out. As the city's skyline multiplied, so did the desperation. Developers threatened to pull contracts if schedules slipped. Investors demanded progress reports measured in feet per week. Contractors, caught between union limits and relentless deadlines, began looking for any source of labor that could help keep the steel moving and the money flowing. The gap between the demand for hands and the supply of union men grew wider with each new permit issued. In this climate, the idea of tapping a cheaper, more flexible workforce, one not bound by union rules or wage floors, became not just attractive, but necessary for survival. Children, overlooked by the unions and unprotected by law, became the next logical, if deeply troubling, solution to the skilled hand shortfall. Formal agreements between construction companies and city institutions gave a veneer of legitimacy to child labor during the skyscraper boom. School board circulars from 1901 to 1903 outlined arrangements where public schools, especially those in working-class neighborhoods, sent boys as young as 12 to summer building camps. These programs, endorsed by the Board of Education, allowed teachers to act as field agents. Principals signed contracts that placed students directly onto construction sites, with each boy earning a daily stipend, usually $1.25, while the school received a placement fee from the contractor. The arrangement was presented as vocational training, but in practice, it filled labor gaps with cheap, compliant workers. Private trade schools and technical institutes also became part of this pipeline. Placement logs from the Manhattan Technical Institute list dozens of apprentices, aged 12 to 14, dispatched to steel frame projects across Manhattan. In these records, teachers are not just educators. They become intermediaries, negotiating terms and tracking attendance on behalf of contractors. The language of opportunity masked the reality. Children were recruited for physically demanding, hazardous jobs, and the schools received a cut for every placement. Orphanages and parish charities operated their own networks. Ledgers from the Children's Home Society between 1900 and 1910 document a clear fee structure. For each child sent to a building site, the society received a hand labor fee, typically 75 cents, paid by the contractor. Boys as young as 13 were listed as building assistants, with their wages docked for room and board provided by the institution. These deductions kept children financially tied to the orphanage, ensuring a steady flow of labor and a reliable stream of income for the charity. In some cases, the contract specified that the child would work a set number of hours per week, with no mention of safety or education. The involvement of trusted institutions, schools, orphanages, parishes, helped normalize the use of children on construction sites. Teachers and charity agents vouched for the placements, reassuring parents and city officials that the work was beneficial, even character building. Yet the contracts themselves, preserved in board archives and orphanage ledgers, reveal a system driven by profit and expediency. Placement fees, daily wage schedules, and deduction formulas were spelled out in plain terms, reducing children to line items in a ledger. The pipeline from classroom or orphanage to construction site became an established route, sanctioned by authority and insulated from public scrutiny. This institutional endorsement paved the way for more informal, street-level recruiting. Its impact lingered. It set a precedent that child labor was not just tolerated, but organized, managed, and monetized by the very organizations meant to protect the city's youngest residents. On the crowded streets of New York's immigrant neighborhoods, a different kind of recruiter prowled the sidewalks. These were not school officials or charity agents, but street brokers, men known as padrones in Italian communities, or simply the agent among Yiddish-speaking families. They moved through tenements and alleys, scanning for boys just tall enough to carry a bucket or quick enough to dodge a city inspector. Their work was quiet, almost invisible, but it formed the backbone of the city's informal labor supply. Padrones advertised in a dozen languages. The Yiddish press promised steady work for strong boys, no experience needed. Italian broadsheets ran notices for ragazzi robusti, while Polish church bulletins listed cash jobs for chłopcy do pracy. These ads often dangled the promise of a cash advance, a week's pay up front just for signing on. For families facing eviction or hungry children, the offer was hard to refuse. Oral histories collected decades later recall how agents would knock on doors, speaking in the mother's tongue, and assure parents that their sons would be safe, even looked after. The reality was far rougher. The promise of cash often masked the danger. Street brokers worked on commission. Every child placed on a site meant a cut from the contractor, sometimes as much as 50 cents per head, a tidy sum when wages for the children themselves rarely topped $1.25 a day. Some padrones kept ledgers tracking their own profits, listing names, ages, and the fee collected for each boy. The system thrived on trust within the community, but also on desperation. Mutual aid societies and parish halls sometimes helped identify families in need, turning a blind eye to what the work entailed. The broker's pitch was simple: work now, eat tonight. For many, it was the only option. Not all deals were above board. Some boys were promised apprenticeships that never materialized. Others found their cash advances whittled away by placement fees or deductions for tools and gloves, items rarely delivered. Oral testimonies from the Lower East Side and Hell's Kitchen describe boys as young as 12 being led from street corners directly to construction sites, handed a set of rags, and told to start hauling bricks or catching rivets. The work was grueling, the hours long, and the risks barely explained. Yet the brokers kept coming, always with another name, another family willing to trade a child's safety for the hope of a better week. This street-level pipeline filled the gaps left by official channels. It bypassed contracts and paperwork, moving children from sidewalk to scaffold in a matter of hours. In the neighborhoods most battered by poverty, the padrones and their English-speaking counterparts became gatekeepers to the city's biggest building sites. Their profit depended on the steady flow of desperate families and the silence of a public willing to look away. In the shadows of rising steel, the business of child recruitment became as much a part of the skyline as the girders themselves. On the skeletons of rising towers, children moved through a daily routine shaped by the demands of steel and stone. Boys as young as 12 became rivet catchers, standing on narrow planks or makeshift platforms, their eyes trained skyward. Above, ironworkers heated rivets until they glowed red, then tossed them down in quick arcs. The boy's task was simple in theory: catch the rivet in a battered tin pail or leather glove before it bounced away or burned through. There was no margin for error. A missed catch meant a lost rivet, a scalded hand, or worse, a panicked scramble on a beam with no railing. Material boys began their shifts before dawn, hauling bricks, limestone, or lengths of steel from ground level to the upper floors. Some loaded wheelbarrows, others balanced bundles across their backs, weaving through a maze of ladders and scaffolding. Contractor job cards from the era list. Quotas: 10 loads an hour, sometimes more when a foreman pressed for speed. The rhythm was punishing. The expectation was clear: keep the supplies moving, or risk losing the day's pay. Scaffold helpers worked alongside carpenters, tightening bolts and holding planks in place as the skeleton of the building grew. Their hands steadied crossbeams while adults hammered or drilled. When a section was finished, children were sent to dismantle old platforms and clear debris, often with little more than a broom or a crowbar. Manuals describe these roles as auxiliary labor, but the reality was constant exposure to falling tools and shifting boards. Other boys swept walkways, collected stray nails, or guarded the site entrances, tasked with keeping away curious onlookers or city inspectors. The job titles, rivet boy, material handler, scaffold assistant, offered no hint of the risk or exhaustion that came with each shift. In every task, contractors relied on the children's speed, small size, and willingness to follow orders. Skill gaps were ignored. The work demanded only endurance and a readiness to obey. For many, these roles became the start and end of childhood, traded for a day's wage on the city's newest towers. Payroll tickets from early skyscraper projects tell a blunt story. Contractors paid adult ironworkers $3 to $4 per day, sometimes more with overtime. Children, by contrast, brought home only $1.25 to $1.50 for a full day's labor, less than half the lowest union wage. On some sites, cost memos itemized this difference in plain terms. Boy labor, $1.25 per day. Journeyman, $3.50 per day. For every child on the roster, the company saved at least $2 per shift. Multiply that across dozens of boys, and a project's labor bill could shrink by 8% or more, a margin that often meant the difference between profit and penalty. A typical wage table from the J.H. Taylor Company's 1902 ledger lists the tiers: adult ironworker, $3.75, material boy, $1.30, scaffold helper, $1.25. Even the rare hazard bonus for rivet catchers, 10 cents extra on days spent on the beams, barely closed the gap. The adult wage reflected years of apprenticeship, union dues, and the leverage of collective bargaining. Child workers, excluded from these protections, were paid in cash at week's end, often after deductions for tools, gloves, or, in the case of orphans, room and board. One orphanage ledger recorded a daily deduction of 15 cents, leaving the boy with just over $1 for a 12-hour shift. Contractors justified these disparities in internal memos. Children, they argued, performed auxiliary labor that freed skilled men for critical tasks. Their small size, willingness to accept low pay, and lack of union membership made them attractive to employers under pressure to cut costs. Cost analysis sheets attached to project budgets showed how substituting child labor for adult helpers shaved thousands from the final bill. In the relentless arithmetic of skyscraper construction, every dollar saved on wages was a dollar added to the bottom line. The skyscrapers that defined the New York skyline rose not just on steel and stone, but on a wage gap that made children a calculated part of the business model. Steel beams and scaffolds offered no mercy to those who lost their footing. Children assigned to catch rivets or haul bricks stood at dizzying heights, sometimes with nothing but a plank beneath their boots. Accident logs from the Singer Building and Flatiron projects record dozens of injuries each season, including burns, broken limbs, and in the worst cases, deaths that barely made the news. In 1904, a coroner's report quietly documented the fall of a 13-year-old boy from a scaffold 30 feet above the sidewalk. He had been catching rivets, a job that required speed and nerve but offered no safety net. Witnesses described how a sudden shout, a missed step, and a slip on rain-slicked timber ended in a fatal skull fracture. There were no harnesses, no guardrails, just the open air and the hard street below. Most injuries went unreported. Company accident logs, when they survived, listed boys by first name or simply as helper. A burn from a dropped rivet, a crushed hand caught between beams, a fall from an unfinished floor were treated as routine setbacks, not tragedies. Contractors rarely faced consequences. The city's early safety codes excluded children from even the minimal protections given to adult workers. Insurance claims for child injuries, when filed, were processed at lower rates than those for men, reflecting how little value was placed on young lives lost or maimed. For the families, the cost was immediate and brutal. A boy's lost wage could mean eviction or hunger for an entire household. For orphanages, a death on site was a line item. One less child to place, one less fee collected. The grandeur of the rising skyline concealed a quiet toll. Children whose names faded from the ledgers as quickly as they had appeared, remembered only in the coroner's files or in the silence that followed a fatal fall. Each skyscraper's silhouette hid the stories of those who never came home. Behind the roar of rivet guns and the scramble of workers, a quieter story played out in boardrooms and city offices. Private correspondence from the Woolworth brothers to their chief contractor in 1912 reveals a careful calculation. Youthful helpers meant lower overhead and faster schedules. The only caution was not about the children's safety, but about avoiding public scandal that might damage the Woolworth name. In a memo from the Flatiron Company, executives reassured themselves that as long as boys were supervised, there was no legal risk. These were not isolated opinions. Trade journals like the Engineering Record ran editorials defending the use of boys as indispensable auxiliaries for the skyscraper trade, while internal memos from companies such as J.H. Taylor Company spelled out the economic logic: cheaper, flexible labor for non-skilled tasks, with savings that could reach 8% of a project's budget. Municipal inspection reports from the New York City Department of Buildings between 1903 and 1910 often noted the presence of boy laborers without recording any violations. In a 1908 inspection of the Singer Building, the official report stated simply, "No breach of labor law regarding age." The statutes, as written, left children in a legal gray area, unprotected by the city's emerging safety codes. Inspectors, pressed by the pace of construction and the interests of powerful developers, rarely intervened. This silence was not accidental. Letters between building owners and contractors show a shared understanding. So long as the work continued and headlines stayed quiet, the risks could be managed. The cost, measured in injuries and lost childhoods, remained hidden in ledgers and accident logs. Public complicity came not just from ignorance, but from a willingness to accept the city's transformation at any price, so long as the scaffolds kept climbing and the profits kept flowing. In the immigrant wards of New York, the struggle to survive played out behind tenement walls and on the city's unfinished steel skeletons. Census records from 1900 and from 1910 paint a stark picture. In neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, 8 or more people often crowded into a single apartment, and nearly 9 out of 10 residents had been born abroad. For these families, a father's wage, sometimes less than $600 a year, barely covered rent and food. Every dollar mattered, and so did every set of hands, no matter how small. Household ledgers and oral histories reveal how the math of poverty shaped daily choices. A mother might send her eldest son, age 12 or 13, to haul bricks or to catch rivets on a job site, knowing his $1.25 per day could mean the difference between a warm stove and a cold apartment. Some families split the burden, a daughter sorting materials after school, a younger brother sweeping debris for a few coins. In the crowded alleys of the Lower East Side, the line between childhood and adulthood blurred under the pressure of bills and landlord threats. For many, the only alternative to hunger or eviction was to accept the risk and send children to work. Community networks sometimes softened the blow. Churches and mutual aid societies occasionally pooled resources to help a widow keep her children out of harm's way, but these efforts could not reach everyone. By 1910, city records showed that in the most densely packed immigrant wards, nearly a third of families relied on the wages of children under 16. This was not a secret or a scandal. It was a daily reality, accepted by neighbors and overlooked by city officials who saw the city's progress but missed the cost paid in childhood's loss to the skyscraper race. A single photograph could do what 1,000 accident reports and wage tables never could: force the public to confront the reality of child labor on New York's rising steel skeletons. In 1912, Louis Hine, a former schoolteacher turned reform photographer, stepped onto a half-finished skyscraper with his camera. He found a boy no more than 13 balanced on a steel beam, the city yawning beneath his feet. Hine called the image "Boy on a Beam." When it appeared in the pages of the survey, and soon after in pamphlets from the National Child Labor Committee, it shattered the easy silence that had protected contractors and city officials alike. Hine's photographs carried a quiet power. They captured not just the danger, but the dignity and exhaustion in the faces of children who had become part of the city's machinery. The National Child Labor Committee, founded in 1904, understood the impact of these images. They printed thousands of pamphlets bearing Hine's work, distributing them to lawmakers, church groups, and civic clubs across the country. Each pamphlet paired stark visuals with committee reports detailing the wages, hours, and hazards faced by child workers on skyscraper sites. The committee's campaigns made it impossible to ignore the risks these children endured for $1 a day. Public outrage began to build. Letters poured into newspapers, demanding an end to what one called the city's invisible scaffolding of children. Community meetings and church halls echoed with debate. Hine's photographs and the committee's relentless documentation transformed a hidden practice into a national scandal, turning sympathy into organized pressure for reform. The silence had been broken not by statistics, but by the undeniable evidence of children perched above the city, captured forever in Hine's lens. Samuel Goldberg's workday began before sunrise, long before the city's streets filled with the noise of commerce. At 14, he was already a familiar name in the payroll ledgers of the Singer Building project. His mother, a widow raising 3 children in a Lower East Side tenement, had signed the placement contract arranged by a parish charity. The paperwork, dated September 1908, promised a daily wage and the hope of a future apprenticeship. For Samuel, it meant climbing to the temporary scaffolds each morning, taking his place as a rivet catcher beneath the ironwork crews overhead. The job demanded quick hands and unwavering attention. Hot rivets, glowing red from the forge, rained down from above. Samuel's task was to snatch each one from the air with a battered leather glove, then pass it to the waiting ironworker before it cooled. There were no safety nets, no harnesses, only the wind and the city yawning below. On a morning in May 1909, a rivet slipped through his grasp, landing square on his hand. The burn was immediate and severe, forcing him to leave the site for 2 weeks. The contractor's accident log noted the injury in a single line. His family, unable to pay for a doctor, watched as the wound healed slowly, leaving a scar that never faded. A clipping from the foreword that summer carried his mother's voice. "We could not afford the doctor's fees, so the wound healed slowly, leaving a scar." Samuel's injury ended his time on the skyscraper. By the next census, he had traded the heights for a sewing machine in a garment factory. His brief career in construction left behind a contract, a payroll entry, and a scar, a quiet testament to the cost extracted from the city's youngest builders. The campaign to protect child workers in construction moved slowly from outrage to law. The Keating-Owen Act of 1916 represented the first national attempt to curb child labor, banning the interstate sale of goods made by children under 14, but the law's reach was limited, and its effect on construction sites was uncertain. Contractors argued that skyscrapers rising block by block in the heart of the city did not produce goods for sale. They built structures. 2 years later, the Supreme Court struck down the Keating-Owen Act in Hammer versus Dagenhart, ruling that only states could regulate labor conditions. This decision kept loopholes wide open for contractors who still saw children as a cheap solution to tight deadlines and labor shortages. Change, when it finally came, arrived through a patchwork of state laws and relentless advocacy. New York's 1920 child labor law set a minimum age of 14 for construction work and barred anyone under 16 from hazardous tasks. But it was not until the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 that federal law finally swept children off high-rise building sites nationwide. The Fair Labor Standards Act, often called the FLSA, made it illegal for anyone under 16 to work in construction and under 18 for the most dangerous jobs. By then, the era of child labor on skyscraper frames was ending, replaced by new standards for safety and age. The legacy of those lost years remains visible in the city's skyline. The Flatiron, Singer, and Woolworth buildings still stand, their steel bones a silent record of the hands that built them. These monuments to ambition and modernity owe as much to the children who once braved their heights as to the architects who drew their outlines. The story of reform is written not only in statutes and court decisions, but in the memory of those who paid the price for progress. Children whose labor, now forbidden, once helped lift a city into the sky. Today, nearly 160 million children worldwide still perform hazardous labor, according to the International Labor Organization. Our skylines may have changed, but the forces that once exploited the youngest hands remain present in new forms. As cities rise ever higher, the true cost of progress demands our vigilance. The next time you pass beneath a tower of stone and steel, remember whose childhoods paid for its shadow. Share your thoughts below.